Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Journalism 606, Media Management and Entrepreneurship. This is Module 7, where we're going to talk about fairness and organizational justice. We'll get straight into the conversation by a quick definition of organizational justice. So organizational justice is a concept that speaks to how employees subjectively perceive the equity, the morality, and the fairness of their organization with regard to the behavior and the outcomes within the organization. Equity theory holds that people make determinations about fairness through an act of social comparison, evaluating their perceived investments or inputs when measured against and set up in kind of a ratio against their perceived rewards or outcomes. Again, this ratio is kind of a cost-benefit determination. If you were to kind of set it up like an algebraic equation, that's what the equation would look like. And there on the left, you see the inputs of the individual divided by the outputs for the individual, measured against or compared against a comparison or a reference person. And again, the reference person's inputs and investments are measured against their outputs in that ratio. And you want to see equality or approximate equality between the two. When we talk about inputs or, again, investments, it could be things like education or experience, training, skills, social status, job effort, personal appearance, health, and possession of tools. Outcomes, when we talk about outcomes, certainly the top of the list is pay. That's what we most often look at when we consider the outcomes or the consequences of work, but also certainly satisfying supervision, seniority benefits, fringe benefits, status symbols, job prerequisites, and working conditions. So again, the theory indicates that exact equality is not necessary for a satisfactory comparison outcome. For instance, the outputs can be higher in the comparison person if one perceives oneself as having invested less or having put fewer inputs into the equation as a reference person. So equity theory is a simple model for understanding just how people determine fairness. However, even with this simple framework, many can find it very, very challenging to foster widespread perceptions of fairness all throughout an organization. The challenges include, well, the first is equity judgments are perception-based. Individual perceptions of inputs and outcomes might vary dramatically from person to person or between people. Also, it's difficult to predict who will be chosen as your comparison or your reference person. A policy change that favors one group may generate perceived inequality when evaluated by another group that benefits less from the policy change. One example of this would be, years ago, some companies started instituting what they called family-friendly policies. So if you were a married employee, you would maybe have certain benefits or you'd be looked at for certain schedules that might facilitate your home life a little bit better and create less work-life imbalance. Problem was that the people who happened not to be either married or in a family or people who were single were looking around like, well, what am I, chopped liver? These guys are getting these benefits and these preferential schedules, and I'm not really benefiting. So again, perfectly well-meaning policies can can be problematic and challenging to implement with exact equality across all different work groups and all different types of people. Also, in addition to outcomes and inputs, people are very, very aware of procedures through which resource and allocation decisions are made, and also the manner in which these decisions are communicated. So organizational justice is a multidimensional concept with three components that I want to discuss. The first is distributional justice, next is procedural justice, and also interactional justice. First, distributional justice. It talks about these judgments being made with respect to outcomes, specifically the input-outcome ratios that employees experience compared relative to ratios of others with whom they identify. That is to say, the reference people or the comparison group. Procedural justice then focuses on the means rather than the ends, as we see with distributional justice. This perspective evaluates the fairness of the methods and procedures themselves which are used to reach these decisions. I should note that allowing people to participate in decision-making more may increase perceptions of procedural justice, either through consensus or at least through some sort of consultative system. Determinations of procedural justice would include consistency, bias suppression, information accuracy, correctability, representativeness, and ethicality. I'll discuss each of these separately. Consistency means that the procedures and decisions that are applied are consistent across time and people. Bias suppression means that the procedures and decisions that are applied are done by a person who has no vested interest in the outcome. There are no conflicts of interest, nor are there any prior prejudices against any of the affected individuals. Information accuracy. The procedures and decisions are based on true and accurate information. If you're solving a problem, it's very, very helpful to know that the problem is defined by true information, that your decision making is informed by accurate and valid information, that your problem is really a problem. So the truthfulness, the truthiness, as some would say, of the information is important. Correctability. This speaks to the procedures and decisions that have built-in safeguards that allow for an appeal or remediation of mistakes or bad decisions. If you do something, can you undo it? Can you back out of it? Correctability. Can it be corrected? Representativeness. This basically talks about everyone, all the stakeholders being represented. The procedure and decision is informed by the concerns of all stakeholders who are affected by the decision. This would include, for instance, co-workers, management, owners, customers, and especially including any individuals that are being adversely affected by the decision. And ethicality. The procedure and decision is ethically informed, that it's consistent with the prevailing moral standards that would pertain to issues such as, but not limited to, invasion of privacy or deception. Ethicality answers the question, is this the right thing to do? Hopefully the answer is yes. So then, moving from procedural justice to the third component, which is interactional justice. This refers to the elements of interpersonal nuance of the policy implementation and the specific treatment of affected employees. So if a decision is communicated in such a way that is socially sensitive, considerate, and empathetic, this is considered a approach of strong interpersonal justice. And this may help diffuse some of the resentment produced by a decision that might lead to outcomes perceived as unfair to particular employees. Determinants of interactional justice include explanation, social sensitivity, consideration, and empathy. Explanation. This simply emphasizes the aspects of procedural justice and fairness actually being observed. That the decision was striving to be fair and provide justice throughout the organization. Social sensitivity simply talks about treating people with respect and dignity. Consideration listens to people's concerns. It's not just listening to respond or listening to argue, especially, but it's listening to understand. Active listening. You listen, you try to understand what the employee is saying to you with regard to this decision, and maybe repeat it back to the employee to show that you have heard them. This is called, again, active listening. And when you parrot something back to an employee, they know that they've been heard. So it's a very, very powerful interpersonal method of just listening to people. And empathy. With empathy, you authentically identify with the person's feelings. So this is where we talk about trust, and this is where this will all kind of make sense, I hope. So organizational trust is fostered by organizational justice. As a cognitive scholar and a psychology graduate student and ultimately a PhD, I became very, very interested in the component of trust. Not only psychologically, but I also knew as a manager how important trust was. I wound up writing my master's thesis on trust. See, it's big and thick. I think a lot about trust, and I've studied it extensively as a decision under uncertainty. So trust is defined as the belief or prediction that a person or thing, you can trust things as well, right, that is trusted, that is a trustee, the entity that you are trusting, will do what is expected. The trustee will do what is expected on behalf and in the best interest of the person who is making said trust judgment, otherwise known as the trustor. So again, this theory says that you can trust people. Obviously, we know we can trust people sometimes, but things as well. You can trust your seatbelts to hold onto you if you are in a car crash. You can trust alarms to go off when there's a fire, we hope. You can trust a sprinkler system to work when there's a fire. So we trust things, we trust people, and certainly we trust organizations. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about organizational trust. Do we basically think that the organization is going to do right by the people who work there? Can we trust the organization? So trust is operationalized. Some people call it an emotion, again, but I consider it a decision under uncertainty. And there's a vast psychological literature in human cognition and judgment and decision making about decisions made under uncertainty. As that would suggest, there is an element of risk in that uncertainty. There is always the element of risk in any trust decision. Basically, you as the truster are making yourself vulnerable to the person or thing that you are trusting. That's risk. So there's always an element of risk in any trust decision. So the theories say that if over time strong perceptions of organizational justice are developed, that is to say, perceptions of distributive, procedural, and interactional justice are fostered, then organizational trust ultimately develops and strengthens. One of your books, First Break All the Rules, talked about employees that give management the benefit of the doubt. The benefit of the doubt from employees. And this describes that when problems happen, the authors talk about employees are being more disposed toward forgiveness when the relationships are strong and when things happen that might otherwise damage perceptions of equity. These employees in these trusting organizations are more inclined to cut management some slack. So this is why trust is so important, and having a trusting culture is so important, and why organizational justice is so important. Trusting relationships tend to facilitate high performance. People spend less time working to sustain the relationships, less time worrying about the relationships, and more time on mission and engaged in highly effective teamwork. In these trusting cultures, a pervasive expectation is present of fair treatment. So, since the expectation is there, they are less compelled to do this equity monitoring, setting up these comparison ratios that we've been talking about. And better yet, the employees tend to adopt a very long-term focus. I put together a little graphic, I guess, that talks about, that shows you actually the relationships between distributional, procedural, and interactional justice. Over time, increasing trust, and over time that increases focus on task and decreases of the focus or sometimes obsession about the quality of the relationships. So the last thing that I want to talk about are the responses to inequity. So when there are perceptions of inequity in a workplace, well, those are problematic at best, and at worst, they might constitute a crisis. If, for instance, your outcomes are greater than others, you might develop a certain sense of guilt or embarrassment. You might even feel as if you're kind of a target or a lightning rod. You might feel a little bit paranoid about it, depending on people's reactions. If your outcomes are less than the reference people or comparisons in your company or your organization, you certainly might develop a certain sense of anger. Possible responses would include, for instance, altering your personal inputs. You may not work as hard. You may pull back a little bit, start sandbagging. More absenteeism actually can happen. Or you might be able to seek greater outcomes. You start pushing your boss for a raise, or start complaining a little bit more about the outcome inequity in hopes that you would get some greater outcomes from your negotiations or feedback. You might engage in cognitive distortions or rationalizations. Well, I really didn't want that raise anyway, or gosh, his situation is somehow different. You also might pick a different reference person as part of that rationalization. Maybe I'm, maybe going to look at the person who's over here instead of that guy. You might try to change the behavior of the reference person. Sometimes, again, like I was saying, people who are receiving disproportionately greater outcomes can indeed become a target. They can receive harassment, be called the boss's favorite or the golden child or the heir apparent. So sometimes that ridicule can indeed change the behavior of the reference person. Or worse of all, you could leave the organization. And as we see in First Break All the Rules, when an organization starts to hemorrhage their talent, that is a problem of the highest order. So, what do you do if you're trying to manage an inequitable situation? Well, the first thing that you should do is address the source of the inequality. Maybe try to increase the outcomes through a pay raise or maybe a reduction of responsibilities or inputs. Maybe address the actual source of the inequity. Also, you can try to persuade the aggrieved employee toward an alternate interpretation of the situation. Like I said earlier, you could point out someone who is less well off and try to convince them to use that person as a reference person. You might point out positive outcomes that the employee who's complaining may not be aware of. Hey, well, by the way, you get holidays off. This guy, he doesn't get holidays off, so, you've got something over him in this case. So you try to convince them of some sort of alternate interpretation of the situation. As a last resort, you are left, if those two things don't work, you are left with apologies or excuses or defenses. With excuses, basically you admit that, yeah, this is an unfair situation, this decision was unfair, but this was out of my control, if indeed it was out of your control. If it's an apology, that's something different. Apologies mean a number of things. The manager admits both harm and responsibility. It's my fault. I am really, really sorry that this harmed you and harmed our relationship. And then the manager is authentic. They convey genuine remorse to the aggrieved employee. You state clearly that this situation is not representative of the past relationship nor of the future relationship. You make a pledge to do better. It is helpful if the apology is accompanied by some sort of gesture or compensation. And lastly, it's very important to say that the higher the trust is in the organization and between the employee and the manager, that tends to predict a more successful acceptance and resolution of the apology. So again, trust is important. Okay, so on the Facebook page, as we wrap up, I wanted to point you out to something that I posted. It's one of my favorite magazines and websites is Fast Company, and 6 ways to tell if your workplace is fair. If you have other posts, if you come across other posts in your reading or just in your browsing of the internet, again, please feel free, be encouraged to post onto our Facebook page. There's some good stuff there. If you noticed on our syllabus, I had mentioned organizational citizenship. Sorry, it's late. Was going to be discussed this week. Got to looking at that, and the more I looked at it, and the more I thought about it, I think organizational citizenship, which by the way means certain behaviors that are assisting other people's work that aren't necessarily in your job title. Organizational citizenship behaviors, OCBs as they're called, probably should be discussed in the organizational culture discussion that we're going to have on week 13. really just a few short weeks away. So I want to table that for the moment and change the syllabus accordingly. And as we wrap up, I have emailed every one of you, and I'd love to meet with you for a virtual coffee break. So if you haven't responded to my email yet, please do respond to my email and let's set up a time. And I'll be getting back to you, many of you who have responded to me, and thank you for that. And I'll be setting up a time. I've already set some times up this week and next week, and I'll get back to all of you and we'll talk. I'm also going to roll back the deadline for picking a case study person 1 week to facilitate these meetings. But in the meantime, think about who you want to do your case study on. Okay, so with that, I bid you farewell. Bye-bye, everybody. See ya.